What's in it? I'm just looking for names. I was actually just looking for bills.
And then I got this, got a addition. I got a Bluetooth speaker this year. Wow. Well, the church has a Bluetooth speaker. All right, come on, why don't you come on? Here we go.
Power on. Waiting for Bluetooth connection. USB speaker disconnected.
You saw it happen today.
So it's Bluetooth, so you can.
I think I go to settings. I've hooked it up before.
Well, that really says
Bluetooth.
Is that it though?
Bluetooth.
I guess it's it.
Connect. Yep. Unless that's one you have at home. No. Have you paired it before?
Yeah, well, I did yesterday just to make sure I could do it, or this morning, I mean.
Okay. So if you've paired it before, it should know the address.
Got it on.
Brother Mike, how are you, sir?
How you been?
I've been good. Still a couple of weeks. You guys must have gone on a trip.
That acts like it's, I guess that may be it. It doesn't, I was not expecting a,
It's it.
there we go. All right, we'll throw that on the table. Get fancy in here. All right, now I think if I hook this. Oh, I should have done get rid of all that first.
Look at this one.
Well, the problem is that I can't get rid of this because I can't hover. This thing, this is what I don't understand. When I plug this in, my cursor goes like that big. And I can't close anything. I can't get it where I need it. So now if I do that and that.
Yeah, there's a second setting where you can make
How you
a
doing?
second display. You ever done that with two displays?
I don't.
No.
I don't like it. I love the shirts. You like fishing shirts?
Oh, now it's got that stupid allow thing on there.
I've got that one.
Back to where I started.
Too many chefs in that kitchen.
Yeah, and eat them, but that's my wife. People who grow fish.
This company is still one of
Bring
the,
them home.
almost every marketing
I've had more than one opportunity.
course in the country
Fishing is a hobby.
talks about Chick-fil-A and what he's done, how he's done, and still closed on Sunday.
Yeah. I mean, you go with a
Oh, what are we gonna do? All these-
lunch
I know.
anytime.
It's crazy. It's just-
Hard to find a
I heard
parking
we had
place.
the
I don't
worst
care
luck
which
this
store
year.
you go to.
I can't imagine
They're
that
all
would be
full.
worse. I know.
New York State Thruway,
If
the person that had the concession
hospitalized.
got Chick-fil-A to come.
Yeah.
Chick-fil-A's closed on Sunday.
Yeah.
Some of the New York people said, well, Chick-fil-A has to be open. At which point all the senators said, no, leave them alone. You brought them in, don't you know they closed on Sunday?
I'm Bill.
All right.
Hey, Matt.
How are you, Jim?
Fine.
Yes, sir.
Other than that's it. Very Richard.
Hey, how are you?
Yeah. It's now.
If them.
With our middle son.
Oh, how you doing?
Whoa.
How you been?
All right, Doc. How you doing?
I haven't had a reason. Probably 6 months.
So tech plays this weekend
That's what I understand.
overseas somewhere?
Hope they show up.
Yeah.
Where they playing?
Florida State in Ireland.
We were over in England when New York played the Phillies. And the people from the United States that went to Europe to see that was unreal.
Really? I guess that was a good excuse to go tour.
I understand it's cheaper to go see Taylor Swift in Europe than.
Our only niece, who's a lawyer, she and some friends flew there.
Yeah,
It was cheaper, the whole trip, everything.
right, the whole thing. Yeah.
Did you know they canceled her concerts in Vienna?
Yeah.
Because of terrorist attack?
You'll have a good. They're not gonna see y'all.
Run out of t-shirts.
I think you got it set up pretty good.
Well, let's see if that holds up.
Thank you, Mal.
There you go.
Good to see you, brother.
How you doing?
Saturday.
Is that Malcolm?
Stood outside, picked up 5 more tickets off the street.
Well, it is, everybody take it later. Before we start, we're gonna go down there. But you don't know how many people.
Saturday night.
Yeah, I can't. It's just so frustrating.
No way.
And then what's amazing.
Well, on the other hand, I
you
do know
wonder,
that.
like, how in the world are they still got in this thing?
I know, but
I
every
don't
time
know how
I,
you can stay after that.
I know, but every time I count them out, they stay in somehow.
Yeah, yeah. But I don't know, that has to be
No.
close to
You can't have Luke Williams who plays third base.
right. So I had an interesting conversation on the radio about calling Josh Donaldson. So what are you doing the next 2 months?
That's funny.
I mean, I can see it.
Yeah.
Y'all, if you didn't get sauce, there's a bunch of sauce over there. Coach Velarde made a good suggestion that we go around the room and introduce ourselves because we got a couple of new folks here. So maybe we'll do that while we're waiting on Brennan to hopefully join us. Wanna lead on? Well, let's let everybody sit.
So, Paul, did you hear if Riley was he hurt? Riley. Oh, he's out.
It's hand or wrist. Something.
Yeah, 6 I mean, he'll be back in time for the first week of playoffs. Is that right?
But then, you had to welcome back.
Oh, that's right.
I mean, you expect a few.
That might go through real fast.
Lose your best pitcher, theoretically, lose your best pitcher, your best player.
Yep.
The first couple weeks of the season, and then it's just one after another.
It's built for some
Mile
reason.
to mile.
That's the only way a foreign team, they can bring people up and replace people for a period of time.
Yes, well, they kind of done that now. They're still.
You know, if Riley went on the injured list, 15 or.
Well, he'll be out until the first week in September. I mean, first week in October.
Ow.
Yeah.
What happened?
Got hit yesterday.
Oh, I know that, but
I mean, it's a fracture.
practice. What a season.
Yeah.
Hey, Daryl. Pretty good. That was a week.
Well, I wouldn't be good. He doesn't communicate a lot.
Life is good.
Took you months to agree to do this.
So name one thing that stands out with the song.
In a different way.
I'm on the list. I called it.
It's so great.
Well, I see right now.
Yeah.
It's like 9:20.
And you know something? We had fun. Okay.
That's what it's all about. It's to serve the Lord, but
We
serve
had
the
fun.
Lord. It's fun.
What is it?
According to him, 9:20, and they canceled 9:30.
Jeffrey worked just like a rented mule.
I'm still there.
Like an Egyptian slave driver.
Running right there.
Like a rented mule.
How's it going, y'all?
Good, good. How are you?
Good, good. All right. Great. All righty. Well, how's the summer been for y'all?
Hot, good summer.
All right. Everyone got their food and everything?
Got our food. We have a Bluetooth speaker this fall, so we'll see if that enhances the show.
Great. I like that. All right. We'll see. Yeah, I'm ready to put on a big show. We'll see. We'll see how that works. All righty. Well, y'all had we had talked to John and I had emailed a little bit about a potential topic, and I suggested Daniel, which is a strange book. Strange in part because we know a lot of the stories in it, but also there's a lot of things about the book that are pretty odd, and it's used in some pretty odd ways. I don't know if y'all have seen that or come across it, but we're going to talk about that in a little bit. But are y'all how familiar would y'all say you are with the book of Daniel? Not much. You know, a couple of stories probably. Got to get the lion's den, I bet, right? A little bit. Remember, Daniel gets put in the lion's den, and he's okay, right? And we got the 3 youths in the fiery furnace. That's another one that people might know from. You know, we tend to. You know, it's kind of funny. You think about this, like those tend to be kind of children's stories, like for, you know, children's church and stuff. And you kind of think, wow, we really tell the kids some pretty strange things, you know, that throwing a guy in a den of lions and burning up some kids, you know, but they happen to live, you know, those are some pretty intense stories. But nonetheless, those are the ones that people tend to know from the book of Daniel. If there's something else people know from the book of Daniel, they tend to be folks that are really into like end time predictions. Y'all come across folks like that, you know, people who like to think about calculating like the end of time, and they'll talk to you about the rapture, and they'll talk to you about like, you know, whatever, they love the Left Behind series and stuff like that. Those tend to be kind of some other folks that get into the book of Daniel. So the book of Daniel is strange because it's in 2 completely different halves. Like the 2 halves of the book hardly match up at all. So Daniel chapters 1 through 6 are really stories about the guy Daniel and his 3 friends, the 3 youth, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And these stories are all with each other like fairly similar, like they kind of follow similar patterns in them, and they seem to have kind of a unified message. And then you get to chapter 7, and chapters 7 through 12 are completely different. It's just an entirely different type of book. It's a different genre. We would call it apocalyptic literature. There's weird visions of beasts coming out of the sea and dragons, and the Ancient of Days comes down with a throne, and there's a book of life that's brought out, and you know it's a really different thing than like the story of the fiery furnace or something like that. Although there is fire involved. So the other thing about Daniel that's really strange is that it's in 2 different languages. So the book of Daniel is part of it's in Hebrew, just like the rest of the Old Testament, but part of it is strangely in Aramaic, which is a language that's related to Hebrew, but that's not Hebrew. So it'd be like finding a book written by French people and part of it's in Spanish, right? You're like, well, I get it, it's close, but why are you writing in Spanish, the language of your neighbor? And then the parts of Daniel that are written in Hebrew are also unique in the Old Testament because they're written so poorly. Some of the sentences don't make much sense. Some of the verbs don't make sense. You know, it's like listening to someone who has a very tenuous grasp on the language try to tell a story. And the parts of Daniel that are in Hebrew are the apocalyptic chapters, or at least most of them, the ones that are all about the end and the fiery furnace, you know, not the fiery furnace, but the like end of days and the lake of fire and all that kind of stuff. That's the stuff that's in Hebrew, but it's in this really poorly like worded Hebrew. So it presents all these strange issues. But I do think that the book of Daniel, both parts of it, the apocalyptic stuff and the kind of court stories, we call them, really do have some wonderful things to teach us. But we have to kind of listen carefully to it. So my idea is we're meeting 3 times over the fall. My idea is to start here with just kind of an overview of Daniel and talk really about Daniel chapter 1 and maybe talk a little bit about chapter 3. The second time we meet, we'll talk about some of these other kind of court stories in Daniel 1 through 6. But then that third last time, we'll talk about apocalyptic literature. We'll talk about the people that you know that might be really into like the book of Revelation, trying to figure out which day is going to be the last day. Well, what's going on with that stuff? Why is that stuff in the Bible? What might be happening there? Is that true or not? Does this stuff actually say what day the end is going? So we'll get to all of that, on that last time. But the basic thing is to say that the book of Daniel has why are these 2 parts of the book even together? They seem to reflect 2 different. They're obviously written in 2 different languages. They seem to reflect 2 different time periods. So Daniel 1 through 6 is all about the exile, the time of the exile, when the people of Judah and Jerusalem were brought to Babylon. So it's a story really of people displaced or in diaspora. And it's a story really about how Jews can survive in diaspora. One of the most amazing things about the ancient Jewish people is that they're the first people that we know that actually survive in diaspora. That is to say that people in the ancient world got pushed around all the time. Like peoples who lost wars would get taken away and enslaved. People who they basically couldn't survive in their land. They ran out of water. They ran out of food. They had to leave, go somewhere else. They would assimilate into the cultures around them. And that's why today there's no such thing as a Moabite. You can't go find an Edomite today. You can't walk around the street and ask for the Philistines and they'll raise their hands, right? All these ancient peoples that the people of Israel were surrounded by are really gone. I mean, there are Egyptians today, that is to say, but these Ammonites, Moabites, Edomites, Girgashites, all these people that you read about in the Bible, Hittites, their cultures don't exist anymore. And their cultures don't exist not because all those people got killed. All of the ancient Phoenicians didn't die. They are literally the people who live in Lebanon today. They're the Lebanese. Those are the Phoenicians. Same DNA, same exact people, but they were acculturated several times in the course of history. They first became Greeks, and then they became Arabs, started to speak Arabic. That is to say that these different cultures, right, overtook the people who lived there. So the people who actually live in like the Jordan, many of them are Palestinians who've been displaced, but many of the people who are from Jordan are ancient Nabateans, but that's their DNA, but they call themselves Arab today. So that is to say that these ancient cultures tended to get wiped away when they lost in war or when they were kind of, there were economic opportunities that were presented to them that were much better, right? So they would just kind of become someone else. The one ancient group that we've got that resists this, the earliest and the strongest, are the Jews. And the question is, why is it that ancient Judaism, who lost, like they got wiped politically off the face of the earth in the year 587 BC, when King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon reacted strongly to them refusing to pay their tax. That's what happened. That's why Jerusalem fell. King Nebuchadnezzar, the Babylonian king, would go around and demand people's taxes every so often. And the king of Judah heard that there was a rebellion in Babylon and decided not to pay the tax because he thought the king would be too occupied. That was bad choice. Nebuchadnezzar put down the rebellion and came over and wiped out Jerusalem. And when he wiped out Jerusalem, wiped out the economic system of the temple and the surrounding areas, reduced the temple to the ground, right? Razed it, burned it, burned the king's palace, left Jerusalem a smoking rubble. It wasn't inhabited for another 150 years. Well, really, I mean, some people came and moved back, but it wasn't really inhabited for a long time after that. Of any substantial number of people, nobody lived there for a good 75 years or so. When this kind of thing happened, people would be deported. A lot of people were taken to Babylon or to the areas around Babylon. When that kind of stuff happened in the ancient world, it was just the end of your people. You gave up. You became someone else. So a lot of the Babylonians weren't actually Babylonians, right? They came from somewhere else. They just assimilated to the Babylonian culture when they were taken there or when they moved there, etc. This is what Abraham does. Abraham comes from Babylon, moves to Canaan, and kind of hangs out with the Canaanites. And he kind of loses he doesn't call himself a Babylonian anymore. People did this in the ancient world all the time. So what happens to the Jews that's unlike any other group of people is that they refuse. They refuse to change. They don't refuse to change entirely. They do change, like they learn Babylonian. They learn how to speak and write Babylonian. We know this because we've got tablets from Jews. I'm doing this because this is how you'd write in cuneiform. You had like a reed stylus, and you do it on clay, and you'd poke it like that, or you'd write that way. So these ancient Jews learned to write in Babylonian. They got some of them adopted Babylonian names. We've got these business archives from these Jewish families during the time of the exile. They were uncovered in the 20th century. And so we know a lot about the lives of some of these individual people. And what's really amazing, they took new names, many of them. Some of them didn't, but they took new names. They learned the new language. They adopted the local customs to a large extent. It seems that most of them just kind of ate whatever everyone else ate. They didn't like keep kosher back then. They just did what everyone else did, except they retained a faith in their God. Even though they didn't have a temple to worship in, they didn't have a space to go to worship their God, which was, this was the end of people worshiping a God. Your God doesn't have a temple. Why would your God? Like, the idea was that the temple was the place that God hung out. Where is your God? And so a lot of the literature of the exile that we see in the Bible is trying to help people figure out, how is it possible to remain a Jew when our place is gone, our king is gone, our God is gone? That's how they understood it. Our God was in the temple. They thought their God lived inside the temple, in the Holy of Holies. That was the God's bedroom. Everyone else has temples like that in the ancient world. The Canaanites have temples like that. The Phoenicians have temples like that. The Philistines have temples like that. And the idea is that the God lives in like the bedroom or something. And so when a foreign army would conquer your temple, they would take the statue of the God out and parade it around and bring it back to their house and then put it in their temple. And now they owned your God. That was the way they understood it. You can see this happening like 1 Samuel 4, when the ark is taken hostage by the Philistines and they put it in their temple, except the ark like knocks over the statue of their god Dagon, and then the Philistines send the ark back. They say the Ark of the Covenant is crazy and we don't like this God, get him out of here. But all to say that this idea of taking someone's God from their temple and moving it to your own, that was the end of like really worshiping that God. That God now served the other God, the God of the Babylonians or the God of the Philistines, whoever took your God. When the Romans ended up busting into the temple after the time of Jesus, they didn't know where to look for. They went in there, and actually there's a Pompey, like the general of Rome, went into the temple once in Jerusalem, and he was amazed and wrote about it and said, they don't have a picture in there. They don't have a statue. Where's their God? They don't even have a God. The Jews were sometimes called atheists because they didn't have an image of their God. They didn't have a statue of their God, which meant their God didn't really exist. Like, they're worshiping nothing. So Pompey says this, and so when the Romans bust into the temple and try to tear it down, they find the menorah, like the lampstand, like the menorah, like the thing you see at Hanukkah. It's just a lampstand. It's just a thing to make it light in the temple. And they bust in there, they find this thing, and they think that that's the closest thing to like a picture they can see in there. So they grab the thing and they run out, and they actually inscribed a monument. If you go to the Forum in Rome today, there's an arch called the Arch of Titus. It's still there. You can still see it. It's right next to the Campidoglio, that big kind of hill where, anyway, there's a kind of museum on top. You can kind of look out over the whole Forum, and you can really see very clearly this Arch of Titus. Titus was the Roman general who became the emperor, but he was the guy who destroyed the temple. And he carved in this arch to commemorate the destruction of Jerusalem. He carved his soldiers taking what he thought was the image of the God of the Jews out of the temple, and it was the big menorah. They're moving the menorah out there. But that's all to say that the Jews should have at the time of Nebuchadnezzar in 587 BC should have just kind of given up, assimilated into the other peoples that lived around them, just like the Moabites and the Edomites and the Girgashites and the Jebusites, just like all those ancient peoples did at one point or another. But they refused. And it was Ezekiel and Jeremiah, the two prophets, who really spoke about that. And they told people, don't give up on Yahweh, because Yahweh didn't give up on you. Yahweh didn't lose. They said instead there was something else happened. Yahweh actually is mad at you. So they said, this is a punishment for things that you've deserved. Nonetheless, it's the beginning of something new. And so Jeremiah said, hey, there's a time to tear down, which just happened. The temple got torn down, but there's also a time to rebuild, and that's coming next. And so you might have heard in Jeremiah this little bit, Jeremiah chapter 29, verse 11, for you know that the plans I have for you, says the Lord, right? This is a kind of a thing that people say a lot, or, they get it crocheted on things and whatever, they put it as their life verse. It's important to recognize that Jeremiah says that, for I know the plans I have for you, says the Lord, plans to prosper you and not to harm you, plans to give you a future and a hope. That is spoken to a people who have just lost everything they've ever known, their homes, their temple, their king. They have nothing, and they're being taken captive to a foreign land. And Jeremiah writes that to them. I have plans for you, says God, in the midst of the exile. And amazingly, some people believed it. And so they held on to these practices and beliefs and their language. They learned Babylonian, but they still hung on to Hebrew. That is to say that they would write sometimes in Hebrew. We got some of these tablets from Babylon of people writing in Hebrew. So they kept their own local culture. But you got to think, if you're a Babylonian and you got these people that you've taken into exile and they refuse to get along with you, they refuse to learn your language, they refuse to work for you in your administration, maybe they refuse to pay your taxes, worthless. And so you might just get rid of them. So Jews living in what we call diaspora, away from home. Jews living in diaspora have to manage a tension, and that tension is how do we retain our identity and our faith and our loyalty to our God, and yet stay alive? And how do we even thrive? Like Jeremiah says in that letter where he says, for the plans I have for you, says the Lord, plans to build your future and a hope and so on. He says, hey, get married, settle down, have kids, buy houses, plant gardens, really make a home there. And then someday you'll come back. Well, many Jews stayed there, and because they made a good living for themselves. And until the 20th century, there were lots of Jews living in Baghdad, in Babylon, right? So that is to say, there's a huge Jewish community living in that area for a long time, because even when they were allowed to come back home, some of them didn't. They had good lives in Babylon, so they stayed there. So that is to say, how do you stay a Jew in a foreign place and yet not lose who you are and stay alive? Maybe even get ahead. How do you work for the administration of the king of Babylon and not sell out? The rules weren't clear then. No Jew had ever tried to really do this. So when they went into exile, the question was, do we eat their food? And we know from the Bible that they didn't have the answers yet. They didn't quite know. Esther is also a story about a Jew living in diaspora in the court of the Persian king. And she eats all the food and drinks all the drinks. So she's got no problems with kosher stuff. She doesn't even think about that. Daniel doesn't really think about that much either. He talks about eating only vegetables. We'll get to that in a minute. But that is to say, he doesn't say hey, the Bible tells me that I can't eat cheese on a burger. You go to a Jewish deli today, you can't order a cheeseburger because they got the kosher rules, right? But those things took a long time to really develop and settle in and become normal for folks. We've got some other texts from this time where Jews are wrestling with these questions and coming up with some different answers. So Daniel, Esther, we've got some Ezekiel, Jeremiah. These are books designed to help people figure out, for the first time in the history of the world, how do you keep your own identity when you don't have a home? And it worked amazingly. So that is to say, we've got there are still Jews today. So this literature is powerful. We know it's powerful because it did something no one else had ever done before. And if we think about these stories in that way, especially Daniel 1 through 6, they're written to people living in exile who are real, who are industrious, who are given opportunities to succeed in Babylonian culture, and yet they ask themselves, how do I stay Jewish? What does it mean to stay Jewish? What does that what does that look like? You know, we can. It looks different for different people in different times, right? You think about like the people who live in New York City who are from Puerto Rico who are in diaspora or whatever, you know, like the Puerto Rican community or the Chinese community, you know, living on Beaufort Highway, right? That is to say these communities that like kind of retain, and there's always questions, right? So if you, we got a bunch of Korean American students at Columbia Seminary. There's a large Presbyterian church in Korea, and many of them have a long-term relationship with Columbia Seminary. So we have a lot of Korean students, and a lot of these Korean students come here, study, and then go back to Korea to be pastors. And many of them bring their children. And some of their children, if they're here for 4 years or so, some of their children don't learn Korean very well and learn English. And this is a real problem for some of them. Like I've had conversations with some of my students who are wrestling really difficultly, like with this question, like my kid's not learning my language. My kid's not going to be like me. How do I pass on my culture and my language? And we got to think that Jews during this period were struggling with some of those same things. How do you stay true to who you are? And like, is that food? Is that types of prayer? Is that like, you know, what does that even mean? So this book is written for that purpose. At least the first 6 chapters are. So let's jump in here. So Daniel chapter 1, and I'll walk us through chapter 1, which tries to explain how some of this works. Okay, so it starts out Daniel 1. In the 3rd year of the reign of King Jehoiakim of Judah, so the last king of Judah. This is the guy who decides not to pay his taxes. And King Nebuchadnezzar, he thinks there's a rebellion. Nebuchadnezzar's not going to come get him. Nebuchadnezzar comes and gets him. Sorry. And but this is the end of the city of Jerusalem, at least at that point. So reign of King Jehoiakim of Judah, King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon came to Jerusalem, and he besieged it. And then it says, the Lord let King Jehoiakim of Judah fall into his power, as well as some of the vessels of the house of God. Now, this is it's like a subtle statement. It's something you kind of might jump over, but it's actually making a big point. You might think, if you're a Jew living in Jerusalem in 587, it would have been commonplace, not just for the Jews, but for everyone in the ancient world, to think, if I lose in battle, my God was weaker. It's really a fight between gods. So if you're the Egyptians and you fight against the Babylonians in battle, the idea was it's kind of like we're fighting armies here. We're going to try to make our armies as good as it can be, but also it's kind of like our gods are fighting. And if we lose, it's because our God was maybe weaker, or our God hated us or something, you know, whatever. But usually it was just they thought like actually our God's lost. Our gods weren't as strong today. And that's an idea. We know some Jews thought this. Some of them thought this because in the book of Isaiah, there's a part of it that talks to the community in exile, and Isaiah says, "Hey, I've heard some of you talking, and you said our God's not strong. Our God lost to Babylon." So this was a pretty typical way for people to think. But Daniel, the book of Daniel, is trying to help people re-understand what's happening. The Lord let King Jehoiakim of Judah fall into his power. So the idea is things on the surface don't look like God's in control. And yet, God's in control. The book of Daniel, from the beginning to the end, the whole thing, the thing that really ties it together, besides the character Daniel, is the idea of sovereignty. Sovereignty is the big question. So if you're in exile, you might think, is my God sovereign? All the evidence said no. Your temple got burned. Your king got killed. Your king was supposed to be the special one chosen by your God, and he died. All of the children of the last king of Judah, this guy, King Jehoiakim, were executed in public, right? I mean, things aren't looking good for you. So that is to say that all the evidence on the ground would say that Yahweh, the God of Israel, is not sovereign. Instead, Bel or Marduk, the god of Babylon, was sovereign. So this is trying to give you a theology of sovereignty when it doesn't look like it. So God is still the one who's sovereign. The word sovereignty occurs more in Daniel than in any other book. So this is a real question. Who's in charge? And God's in charge. Daniel's also unique in that there's one chapter that says this, chapter 9, but no other chapter of Daniel says that it was the Jews' fault. So Jeremiah, Ezekiel are pretty consistent. A lot of the books that deal with the exile are pretty consistent. That is to say that the prophets say that the people deserved it. They did a lot of bad stuff, and God decided to start over again. And the exile was a time to kind of like let the land and the people lay fallow for a little bit, and then God was going to try to start back up the engine and try to make them into the kind of people who could spread God's blessing to the nations again. Daniel's a little different. Daniel says nothing about that. What Daniel seems to think instead is that God has allowed Judah to be destroyed in order to spread the people of God around the world, so that the peoples of the world can get to know Yahweh, the God of Israel. That's the claim. The main character of the first 4 chapters of Daniel is not Daniel. It's Nebuchadnezzar. So we'll see this actually. If you read Daniel chapters 1 through 4, you'll see the main character is Nebuchadnezzar, because Nebuchadnezzar is the one who changes. And everything in these stories is built around the idea that Nebuchadnezzar is the one who's going to change. So Daniel gets taken. It says the vessels of God, the stuff in the temple, like the menorah, all gets taken into Babylon, into exile. And we'll get to those later. And then the king commanded his palace master, I'm in verse 3. The king commanded, so Nebuchadnezzar commands his palace master Ashpenaz to bring some of the Israelites of the royal family and of the nobility, young men without physical defect and who are handsome, versed in every branch of wisdom, endowed with knowledge and insight, and competent to serve in the king's palace. So basically, this guy is told by King Nebuchadnezzar, go find all the best young Judahites. Go find all the best young kids of Jerusalem. I want them to work here. And of course, the ancient kings did this, right? Like if you conquered another city, you'd find the elite. And if there were any there that would want to work for you instead of die, you'd be like, come on, work for me, right? So grab all these smart young whippersnappers, and we're going to put them through the paces and see what they've got. And if they're good enough, we'll let them join our administration, right? So get these guys who are wise, and we want them to be, good looking too, right? We want the best of the best, the creme de la creme, right, of these Judahites. And then it says they were to be taught the literature and language of the Chaldeans. Chaldea is an ancient name for Babylon. At the time the book of Daniel was written, that word really means like scholar, a scholar of Babylon, which meant you would like learn stuff like astrology. That was a big part of ancient Latin, oracle reading, omen reading, trying to tell the future, like what the gods want from you, all kinds of stuff, but also stuff like how do you collect taxes and how do you write letters, that are administrative letters from one king to a governor or something. How do you conduct negotiations for things? Whatever, all this kind of stuff that you need to learn to be there. So you might think that Daniel might say, no, I don't want to learn this stuff, or I don't want to learn the religious stuff that you'd have to learn to function in the Babylonian court, or I don't want to learn oracle reading stuff or whatever. Instead, it seems like Daniel says, okay, I'll learn this stuff. So verse 5, the king assigned all these young people who were taken a daily portion of the royal rations of food and wine. So they get the nicest food because you want to get them brain food so that they are healthy and strong so they can think well. And they're to be educated for 3 years. So at the end of that time, they can be stationed in the king's court. So they go to college, basically, right? So they're going to college. They're on the meal plan, the royal meal plan, and they're learning all their language and administrative stuff. And so we're going to see if they can make it, if they can cut it here. And among them were Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, all from the tribe of Judah. The palace master gave them other names. Daniel he called Belteshazzar. So Belshazzar is actually a good Babylonian name. There's a king later on that we'll find it in chapter 5, whose name is Belshazzar. But Belteshazzar doesn't make any sense. It's like a silly name. It'd be like calling someone like Mike-tol. It's like a name you sort of know, but it's weird. And it seems they give them these names to kind of make fun of them a little bit. So Daniel gets this new Babylonian-ish name, Belteshazzar. Hananiah gets the name Shadrach. Mishael gets the name Meshach, and Azariah gets the name Abednego, which means something like servant of Nebo, but it's misspelled. So they get these weird names to set them apart as different, right? So they can't fully assimilate. Now, Daniel and his friends say, okay, we'll take the jobs. We'll learn your language. We'll learn your culture. We'll learn your religion. We'll take these new names. That's fine. But Daniel says, I'm not going to eat the food. Now, why? Because of kosher laws? I don't know. He doesn't say anything about the law of Moses here. It's unclear. But he says, I'm not going to eat the food. Daniel resolved he would not defile himself with the royal rations of food and wine. Esther eats the food and wine, and she's just fine. So I don't know exactly what's happening here. But it seems that he's picking something to draw a line. Like, I got to retain my identity somehow. And for him, the food is the thing. So then verse 9, now God allowed Daniel to receive favor and compassion from the palace master. So the guy who's in charge, Ashpenaz, is like, thinks nicely of Daniel. And God has done that. Now, notice that God doesn't like come out of the sky and throw lightning bolts or like destroy the Babylonians or I don't know, like do some sort of miracle and change the like make it so that Daniel can do whatever he wants. During this period in time, ancient Israelites understood God to be working behind the scenes, remotely almost. These people did not perceive God's presence very clearly, right? The temple was gone, the king was gone, their houses were gone. They didn't like see God working in their lives very clearly. And so the book of Daniel and some other books from this time, it's almost like they see God working almost like anonymously, right? Like you have to look really hard to like see God at work in the world. The book of Esther is unique in the Bible for not mentioning God. God's not mentioned in the book of Esther. So you can like see God at work in the book of Esther, but you have to squint, right? And so this is Daniel is different from that. But nonetheless, just see how like when God is helping Daniel, it's by just making the palace master a little bit nicer to him. But Daniel still got to do all this work, right? So this is a theology for a time when God is perceived differently. So nonetheless, so God allowed Daniel to receive some favor and compassion from the palace master. The palace master said to Daniel, "Hey, I am afraid of my lord the king. He has appointed your food and your drink. If he should see you in poorer condition than the other young men your own age, that would endanger my head with the king." Okay, so basically Daniel asked the palace master, "I don't want to eat the food. It's nice food. It's been given to us so we can be healthy. I don't want it." The palace master says, "I don't care about you. I care about the king getting mad that I'm not doing my job. My job is to make sure you're well fed and you're healthy. If he sees you and you look sick, game's over. I'm gonna get it." Then Daniel asked the guard. So just notice here, Ashpenaz, the palace master, did not say no. He did not say no. He didn't say no, you have to eat the food. He said, if you look differently, I'm in trouble. Period. This is how power works. This guy doesn't really care if Daniel eats the food or not. He just cares whether or not he's going to be on the chopping block for it. So it's not a no. It's a don't let me know, right? Don't let me know about it. Don't let anyone know about this. You can do whatever you want. Just make sure that nothing looks like it's changing. So then Daniel goes and asks the guard, like the guy who's like in charge of him and his friends, but just like this, like, lower level guy. And Daniel says to this guy, "Please test your servants for 10 days. Let us be given vegetables to eat and water to drink. You can then compare our appearance with the appearances of the young men who eat the royal rations and deal with your servants according to what you observe." First of all, interesting fact, and if anyone's interested in science in the room, this is the oldest, as far as we know, the oldest like experiment with a control group that we've got in the history of the world. So interesting point there, right? You got all these young men that are eating the royal rations, and then they're not going to eat the royal rations, and then you compare them after 10 days and see if there's anything different, right? This is basically how science works. But nonetheless, this is the first appearance of that method, the scientific method there, right here. But nonetheless, so you can compare it. Now notice he says just 10 days, so that if there's a little bit of a difference, you can stop the experiment, force us to eat the food, we'll eat it, whatever. And the guy agrees. Now you got to think, what's in this for the guard? Like, why would the guard want Daniel and his friends to try this experiment to see if they look healthier after not eating food? What's in it for the palace guard is that he gets to take the food and wine. That's what he gets out of it. The narrator lets us know that in a little bit. But notice that Daniel is being really savvy here, right? He's giving people some things that they want. He's taking the tacit yes of the guy who runs the palace, right? This guy who didn't say no. He just said, "Don't let me know." Daniel knows, he gets how to like, and remember, this is literature designed to help Jews live in a place that is hostile to their identity. It's telling them how they can navigate that, right? How do you keep your identity and not die, even get ahead? So here's this, right? So the palace guard agreed He said, okay, for 10 days, you can try this out. And at the end of 10 days, it was observed that Daniel and his friends appeared better and fatter, like stronger, than all the young men who had been eating the royal rations. So the guard continued to withdraw their royal rations and wine. That is to say, he takes it home, he sells it, or eats it himself. His family's doing well. And then he gave them vegetables. That's it. Now, I've seen some stuff. It's like a Daniel fast or something. And, this is not like it's not being promoted as like a diet, right? This is supposed to be a miracle. So this is supposed to be pretty a strange thing that's happening. But nonetheless, to these 4 young men, God gave knowledge and skill in every aspect of literature and wisdom, and Daniel had insight into all sorts of visions and dreams. And then at the end of that time, the king had set for them to be brought in. Let's say 3 years go by. We fast forward, we got the montage scene here. 3 years go by, they study, they get great grades. The palace master brought them into the presence of Nebuchadnezzar, and the king spoke with them. And among all the students, nobody was found to compare with Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. And they were stationed in the king's court. In every matter and wisdom and understanding concerning the king, which the king inquired of them, he found them 10 times better than all these magicians, all the guys who worked for the court. And Daniel continued there until the first year of King Cyrus. Now, let me ask you a question, though. Sounds like a happy story. What's going to happen to all of the other Babylonian counselors and officers and officials when these 4 Jewish guys rise to the top?
You're no use.
Yeah. They're going to try to take him out. Yeah, that's what happens, right? Yeah. So the outsiders come and rise to the top. The Babylonians have got them in their sights. And so the next few chapters are the Babylonian counselors trying to wreck these guys and take them down. I'm going to jump real quick to chapter 3. So chapter 3 is a story you might have heard, this of a fiery furnace. The youth are thrown in the fiery furnace. One thing that's interesting here is Daniel doesn't show up in the story, like he doesn't exist at all. Not even mentioned. But regardless, these may be stories that were different in the ancient world and were gathered together at some point. But nonetheless, King Nebuchadnezzar made a golden statue whose height was 60 cubits and his width was 6 cubits. So it's like a tall, very skinny statue. And he set it up in the province of Babylon, in the plain of Dura, the big plain in Syria. So King Nebuchadnezzar sent the satraps, the prefects, the governors, the counselors, the treasurers, the justices, the magistrates, and all the officials of the province to assemble and come to the dedication of the statue that King Nebuchadnezzar had set up. So it doesn't actually say what the statue is. Some people think it's Nebuchadnezzar himself or it's his god. It's unclear. It kind of doesn't matter, right? The story's not really about Nebuchadnezzar. The story's about you and me and everyone else. Anything that's put there, anything that's set up that you've got to worship, that you've got to bow down to, that's going to take away your identity, or that's going to make you idolatrous, right? Anything that you're going to be tempted with worshiping instead of God, putting in pride of place instead of God, right? And we're all tempted with this stuff all the time, not with statues so much, but how about money or power or position or sex or I don't know, even just like kind of being cool or something, like whatever, like showing off, like all of these different things that we can kind of put in place, all our narcissism, our self-centeredness, right? You can put all these things up and set them up as a statue instead of God. And notice that Nebuchadnezzar is forcing everyone, all of the satraps, the prefects, the governors, and these lists are actually repeated throughout chapter 3 with all these lists of everything. And it seems like Nebuchadnezzar prides himself in being able to control everyone and everything. He's going to make all of them bow down to the statue that he's made. That's his own idolatry. He wants to control things and control people. So he gathers all this stuff and he forces them to do it. So verse 3, so the satraps, the prefects, the governors, the counselors, the treasurers, the justices, the magistrates, and all the officials of the provinces, they all assembled, just like Nebuchadnezzar said, and they went to go bow down to the statue. And when they were standing before the statue, the herald, like this, right, he proclaimed, "You are commanded, O peoples, nations, and languages, that when you hear the sound of the horn, the pipe, the lyre, the trigon, the harp, the drum, and the entire musical ensemble, you are to bow down to the statue that King Nebuchadnezzar has set up. Whoever doesn't bow down will be thrown into a furnace of blazing fire." Now, this is a strange thing. In the ancient world, we don't actually have evidence of anyone ever being thrown. There's no punishment for being thrown into a blazing fire or something. That wasn't a thing people did back then. This is, I think, supposed to be kind of hyperbolic, right? So we got this kind of crazy punishment for not bowing down to a statue. And then it says, verse 8, accordingly, at this time, certain Chaldeans, now remember that word kind of means like the wise people or like the administrators, the high up administrators, the bureaucrats, right? The powerful ones. They came forward and denounced the Jews. The Aramaic here, this part's written in Aramaic. The Aramaic here says they chewed them up into little pieces. Kind of it's like a way of like they talked junk about them, right? They wanted to like chew them up with their talk. They said to King Nebuchadnezzar, "O king, live forever. You, O king, you've made a decree that everyone should fall down at the sound of the horn, the pipe, the lyre, the trigon, the harp, the drum, and this entire musical ensemble, and bow down and worship that golden statue you set up. And whoever doesn't do this, you said was going to be thrown into a furnace of blazing fire." So there are certain Jews whom you've appointed over the affairs of the province of Babylon: Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Now, where's Daniel? I don't know. But nonetheless, these three guys have been, obviously the Babylonians, like the Babylonian administrators, they're jealous of these three guys. They're just looking for any reason to try to kill them. But also notice that it just so happened that on the day everyone was supposed to show up and bow down and worship the statue, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego called in sick to work. Just happened, right? Now, notice they're not protesting. They're not burning things down, like, they're not screaming. They're not trying to kill the king or fight back. This is not literature of revolution. This is literature about how to be smart and stay alive, but not compromise your core identity. How do you still be a faithful Jew and yet survive and even thrive in Babylon? So the other people notice, right? The Babylonian administrators notice there are certain Jews that you pointed, and these pay no heed to you, O king. They're not listening to you. Now, they're not just saying they disobeyed this. They're like, this is symptomatic, right? These guys never really are listening to you. They're always suspicious, right? Because they've got higher call than you, right? They answer to something. I remember like reading and hearing about when John F. Kennedy was running for president, right? First Catholic president, Roman Catholic president of the United States. He had to answer these questions, right? Like like he went to kind of did some town halls and some public speeches where people got to ask questions of him. And of course, a lot of people, he was the first Catholic who was in a place of perhaps, becoming president of the United States. And people were worried, legitimately worried about whether or not he was going to answer to the Pope above the people of the United States of America. And I've watched, I've got this on footage, right? You can like watch some of these conversations that Kennedy's having with like groups of people where he's standing at a lectern and these local people are raising their hands and they say, are you going to obey the Pope? If it comes down to the Pope, if the Pope says we have to do something that the United States doesn't want to do, are you going to listen to the Pope or us? Right? This kind of question, I think, is a little bit what you're seeing here. There are these suspect Jews here in the kingdom of Babylon, and are they really for you, right? That's the question. Like, we're going to try to suss this out. They don't serve your gods. It's a big thing. Remember I said that Jews were considered atheists? Everyone in the ancient world thought that all of the gods were real. The people of Canaan thought that the Egyptian gods were real. The Egyptians thought the Canaanite gods were real. The Canaanites thought that the Babylonian gods were real. The Babylonians thought the Canaanite gods were real. They all thought each other's gods were real. The only ancient people we've got that say that other people's gods don't exist is the Jews. And as a result, they were called atheists by everybody. And later on, Christians are called atheists by the Romans as well, because they denounce the gods. They say that the gods don't exist. So you've got some atheists on your hands, right, that have some higher allegiance that we don't understand. They don't think the gods exist, and they will not worship the statue you set up. They don't obey you. They don't even believe in your gods. These guys are suspect. They're like a sleeper cell, right? So then Nebuchadnezzar was in a furious rage, and he commanded that Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego be brought in. So they get brought in. Nebuchadnezzar said, "Then is it true, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, that you do not serve my gods and that you do not worship the golden statue that I've set up?" And he gives them kind of an out, right? They can be like, no, we'll do it right now, right? Like, just give us a sec here, just put it up here. Well, play that pipe and horn and trigon and lyre and stuff. We'll fall down, right? He says, "Now, if you are ready when you hear the sound of the horn, pipe, lyre, trigon, harp, drum, the entire musical ensemble, then bow down, and then it's well and good. Everything's cool. But if you do not worship, you shall immediately be thrown into a furnace of blazing fire. And who is the God that will deliver you out of my hands?" Now, two things. One is the Romans did this, right? The early Christians. There's tons of stories It wasn't as widespread as many Christians believe, but still, that there were times and places in the Roman Empire in the first couple of centuries, going into the early 3rd century, where there were persecutions of Christians. And this is literally what would happen. It would say, bow down and worship the emperor. If you don't, we'll kill you. So this is happening here back in the year, whatever, 50 BC. But if you don't worship, and then the ending of that quote is really, that's the theological kicker there. Who is the God that would deliver you out of my hands? Who's more powerful than me? What God are you worshiping, right? You atheists over there. What do you even believe in? You believe in anything that can help you? Well, then Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego answer the king. Now, notice, many Christians today might, if they're asked this kind of question about Jesus, might be tempted to try to prove Jesus' existence or prove that Jesus was the best, or like in some way be like, Jesus is going to show you. But notice what they say. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. This is their answer. O Nebuchadnezzar, we have no need to present a defense to you in this matter. Notice they say if our God whom we serve is able to deliver us from the furnace out of the blazing fire and out of your hand, O king, let him deliver us. But if not, be it known to you, O king, we will still not serve your gods. We will not worship the golden statue you've set up. So we might think in this story that they would say, our God's going to save us because our God's the best and our God's better than you. But instead, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego say the right thing, which is, it's in God's hands, not mine. My faith is not dependent upon God saving me. My faith is dependent upon the fact that God is the sovereign. God's the one who's actually in charge, not me. And I can't speak on God's behalf. This is a great, wonderful answer. It's also probably not what Nebuchadnezzar was imagining that he would hear. If God wants to save us, great. If God doesn't want to save us, great. It's up to God. So then Nebuchadnezzar was so angry that he ordered the furnace, pumped up to 7 times as hot as it was before, and he ordered some of the strongest guards in his army to go bind up Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, throw them in that fire, that furnace of blazing fire. So the men were bound. They were still wearing all their clothes. They were thrown into the fire. In other words, saying like the clothes should burn up, like they should be burned up, everything should be burning up. Because the king was so strong-willed about this, and he ordered to be so hot, like even the guys throwing them in ended up burning. And then King Nebuchadnezzar was astonished, and he rose up quickly, and he said to his counselors, wait, wasn't it 3 guys we threw into the fire? And the counselor said, yes, true, king. And he replied, but I see 4 men, and they're unbound, like the ropes burned away, but they're still okay, walking around in the middle of the fire, and they're not even hurt. And the 4th kind of looks like a god. And so it says, has the appearance, the likeness. It looks like a god. That's in the Aramaic. Nebuchadnezzar then approached the door of the furnace, the blazing fire, and he said, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, servants of the Most High God, come out, come here. So notice that what Nebuchadnezzar has ended up doing is admitting there must be a God who's stronger than me. He doesn't have a name yet. Nebuchadnezzar doesn't even know, but whatever God you're worshiping, it's got to be the highest one. So Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego come out of the fire. And the satraps, the prefects, the governors, the king's counselors, they gathered together, and they saw that the fire had no power over these men. That word is sovereignty in the Aramaic. So, who is sovereign? What is sovereign? That's the question here. Nebuchadnezzar said, blessed be the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who has sent his angel and delivered the servants who trusted in him. They disobeyed the king's command and yielded up their bodies rather than serve and worship any god except their own. Therefore, I make a decree. Any people, nation, or language that utters blasphemy against the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego shall be torn limb from limb. The Aramaic there literally is, shall be made into a pile of limbs. And their houses shall be laid in ruins. This is a little blue here, but the literal Aramaic is, and their houses will be turned into public latrines. So laid in ruins is like a nice way to put that for the translator. But their houses are going to be turned into literal public latrines. For there is no other God who's able to deliver in this way. Now, this sounds like maybe for a lot of people like a win. Like this is what Nebuchadnezzar should have done. Now notice Nebuchadnezzar goes from saying, I'm going to kill you if you don't bow down to my statue, to saying, I'm going to kill you if you say anything bad about whatever God these guys are worshiping. I wonder if Nebuchadnezzar has not quite yet understood the point of God's sovereignty. Because at the end there, Nebuchadnezzar is making himself the sovereign. He's the one who decides who lives and who dies. And he's the one who's going to put some sort of like test of orthodoxy to everyone. And he's going to kill you if you don't do what Nebuchadnezzar wants. The reason I say that he might not be saying the right thing is, first of all, that doesn't sound like what Nebuchadnezzar, like Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego said, if God wants to do this, great. If God doesn't, great. It's in God's hands. Nebuchadnezzar here jumps to his own conclusion and makes his own rule, his own law. And he's going to kill people if they don't follow it. Sounds a lot like what he did at the beginning of the story. Chapter 4 is a story that kind of progresses from here and tries to show that Nebuchadnezzar had a lot more to learn. We can come back and talk about chapters 4 and 5 and 6, the lion's den story, next time. Chapter 4 is where Nebuchadnezzar turns into like an animal. Chapter 5 is the writing on the wall, the handwriting on the wall, and then chapter 6 is the lion's den. And these all share some similarities to them. So we'll treat those next time. The thing we'll come back to the week after, or the session after that, is we're going to tackle the stuff that starts in chapter 7, which is the apocalyptic sections, which sound nothing like these stories that we've been reading so far. Let me stop there and just say any questions or comments or anything kind of step out, anything that doesn't make sense to y'all?
I was under the impression that the Jews did not want to lose their Jewishness.
Yeah.
And well aware of what happened to the lost 10 tribes. And they did not intermarry because you want to lose that Jewishness. And I think today, in this time, they still do that for the most part.
Yeah, and so it was a tension back then, and it's still kind of a tension today in some ways. But yes, there's a predominant idea that there should be kind of you should marry your own, and if you don't marry your own, you should try to get them to convert to you. So there's some, a lot of people called proselytes, right, who convert to Judaism when they get married. But it's not always true, right? So Esther marries the king, and the king doesn't become a Jew, but she's still a Jew. So it's possible in these stories to remain who you are. Daniel's an interesting one in that way, because Daniel doesn't get a family, and neither do Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And the stories of Daniel continue for many years. By chapter 7, Daniel's an old man. So why would Daniel not get married and have kids? It's because he was made into a eunuch, along with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. This is a common practice in the ancient world. If you went to go work in the court of a foreign king, they would cut off your testicles so that you could not seize power and take the throne and start a lineage of your own. This was a real common thing. I mean, this was a thing in Egyptian courts until the modern era, like the Mamluks, until like the 18th century, were like a really powerful group in Egypt. This was a real common thing to try to make it so that you couldn't have your own genealogy, right? You couldn't have your own, you couldn't have a house, like the House of Windsor or something, right? Because you couldn't have kids. But that made it safe for you to work in these courts, and it made you also safe to work with women. So in the book of Esther, there's a court eunuch that works with Esther, and it's okay for him to work with the king's wife because he's not going to mess with her. The king's made sure of that. And this is referred to in the book of Isaiah. In the book of Isaiah, Isaiah prophesies. He says, and when the destruction of Jerusalem comes, the children of the elite are going to be made into eunuchs. This is also what happened to Nehemiah. So Nehemiah, the book of Nehemiah, he's got no kids, no family. Ezra's got no kids, no family. It's because they were high-ranking officials in foreign courts. Nehemiah worked for the Persian king, and so did Ezra. So Daniel, and he's got no kids, got no progeny. They all wrestle with this in different ways because that was a big deal in the ancient world. Book of Nehemiah, if you read it carefully, Nehemiah says over and over and over again, remember me, remember me. And he says, I'm writing this book. He writes, the book, right, of Nehemiah. He says, I'm writing this so that you remember me. It's because he's not living on through his kids, which is like the way they understood eternal life to happen in the ancient world. They didn't know about resurrection yet. We'll get to that the last week. Daniel's the first book of the Bible, the earliest book of the Bible to mention resurrection. So that is to say that not having kids was like a big deal for them. But generally in exile, yes, the idea was that they were supposed to kind of perpetuate the people and intermarry with each other. Yeah.
When I was reading the book of Jeremiah, the footnotes, it said that Jehoiakim the last king of Judah,
Right.
was a good friend, became a good friend of the king. Of
Yes.
I guess it was Nebuchadnezzar, I don't know.
And was let out of, yeah, and was let out of, I mean, there weren't really many jails in the ancient world, in part because they didn't have the food or resources to like just feed people who didn't work, right? I mean, so they'd either kill people, or they would like kind of put you under like supervised work, right? Like a labor camp. They had those. But so very few people were like actually kept as prisoners, and usually it was like a political thing. And so yeah, the king of Judah, taken into exile, was made like a political prisoner. And yeah, it's in Jeremiah. It's also the very last bit of the book of Kings, 2 Kings 25. The very last verses are King Jehoiakim is in prison, and, this political prisoner in Babylon. And for some reason, not explained why, God gave favor, and Jehoiakim is let out of prison, and he's given like nice rations, which sounds strange. What's amazing is that in the 20th century, in an archaeological dig in Babylon, they dug outside Baghdad, they dug up King Jehoiakim's ration tablets. It's a real thing. This document, you can go Google King Jehoiakim's ration tablets, and King Jehoiakim, there's a tablet from Babylon, the Babylonian king, saying, "Hey, from Nebuchadnezzar, give this guy tons of stuff," and he like actually gets like this really nice, a lot of like olive oil and like nice food. So we have no idea why exactly, but yeah, the idea, I think it's a gesture saying the end is, this is not the end. God is still working providentially, right? This is kind of a providence, a long game, right? This kind of God working behind the scenes. And in that book of Kings, right, Kings kind of starts with like a high note with like, King Solomon being rich and everything's great. And like the unified kingdom is huge and everything. And then things kind of go downhill. They continue to go downhill for the rest of that book. And by the end of Kings, by the end of 2 Kings, everything's gone. And so that little gesture of hope at the end is trying to tell people, I think, like you have to look, like things aren't great. Things are actually awful. But you have to kind of look for signs of God's presence and God's activity, but they're there. You just got to look for them and have hope. So I think Daniel, speaks to people who are in positions of crisis, trying to tell them God is still working with you, but it also speaks to people who find themselves in places that are uncertain. A lot of Christians might be able to think about this, right? How do you be a Christian? Let's say you have work in an industry where, you kind of have to say some things that aren't true sometimes, or you have to butter people up who you think are really kind of bad people, or you have to, a lot of people are put in positions in kind of uncomfortable jobs, and you have to kind of make choices, right? You have to negotiate. Am I really going to do this? Is this the step too far where I'm losing who I am, and I'm losing my faith in my practice of faith, of believing in God? Am I losing what it means to be a Christian at this point here? And Daniel is trying to help people kind of think through those things, right? What is the step too far? For Daniel, it was eating the food, and for the three youth, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, we're not going to bow down. It's showing you where some of these lines are, but it's kind of vague. It's really trying to just get you to we have to think through these things, and in the midst of all that, we have to say, who's the real sovereign? Who's the one who's really in charge? That's it. Other thoughts or questions or anything?
Thank you very much.
Yeah,
Thank you, Brendan. Sounds like the lesson's
Thanks,
still
Brendan.
applicable today.
Yeah. Well, great to see you all digitally, and yeah, I'll look forward to hanging out next time.
Sounds great.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Peace, y'all.
All right. Thank you.
Trying to make.
We're pretty.